My name is Connor Judge. I am the manager of cities at the Cities Deepening Community Team. I will be your support this afternoon for this webinar. The webinar is titled Creating Safety Through Connection, the Functions of a Safe Community. And today we're welcoming Chief Mike Butler and our very own Dan Ritchie. Before we get started, we just want to kind of have a few slides. In the first, we just want to do a land acknowledgement. So we begin today's conversation by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. For those of us who are settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. This recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm joining from Tekaronto, colonially known as Toronto. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. By acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I'm trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, and political context embedded within the lands known as Canada, and commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land. So please, within the chat, if you know, share what lands you are joining us from. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Connor. And thanks everyone for joining today's fireside chat. So our conversation is creating safety through connection, the functions of safe community. And so I'm Dan Ritchie, a manager of cities with the Cities Deepening Community Team here at Tamarack. And our work is largely influenced by asset-based community development along with collective impact. And as we seek to support those who are supporting community members in order to reduce social isolation and create a sense of belonging by building on the strengths of residents. And so I would like to invite you throughout our conversations with Chief Mike Butler around inviting questions that you might have. So using either the chat or the Q&A. If you have questions that are going to be coming up, we'll be getting to that towards the end of our conversation. And so I wanted to also take a moment to acknowledge that this topic of safety and security is complex. It can be contentious and polarizing in some ways. And Deepening Community is joining this conversation as open learners, and we're looking to learn from other individuals and groups that are looking to co-learn with us. And I'll explain a little bit later in the end of our webinar around what our next steps will be in this conversation as we look to develop an online community practice around safety. And so I wanted to, say an introduction towards our guest speaker today, the former police chief of Longmont, Colorado, Mike Butler. And so Mike Butler was a public safety chief in Longmont, Colorado. He reinvented public safety within the context of partnerships and leveraged community's social capital. During his tenure, Longmont's public safety instilled a philosophy that included the utilization of many alternative options to the criminal justice system. And so those options embrace the restorative principles and practices in public safety's response to numerous social and health issues in their community. So many of those responses were applicable to what Mike thought was important too, which is strengthening the resilience of neighborhoods. So Mike sought to support communities throughout North America and currently does so in supporting communities that are looking to learn different ways and rethinking and resetting their own public safety responses to various social and health issues. So I'd like to say very much thank you for joining us today and welcome former police chief Mike Butler.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here.
Yeah, great. So I'd like to start off our conversations today and understanding that within Longmont, while you were a police chief, you had a really innovative approach towards policing and supporting local communities. And we're drawn to the idea of you using the ability to build trust and build off the strengths of residents. So I'm looking to start our conversation off today by understanding a bit more about the context within Longmont and understanding your journey as a public safety chief. And so through your work, which often feels like it really aligns with asset-based community development, and I know you're a close friend of John McKnight, the co-founder of asset-based community development, which is, who's also a friend of Tamarack's as well. And there's an idea that there's a saying within asset-based community development that when you've seen one community, you've seen one community. And so as part of your journey within the one community of Longmont, Colorado, could you describe a bit more about the context of the police department when you initially joined, and what inspired your organization to attempt to balance the relationship between residents and the police department?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Dan. First of all, Longmont, Colorado, town right now of around 100,000 people. We have like 30 to 35% Latino Hispanic population. And when I initially started this work back in the mid 1990s, the police department was truly a faceless entity within the community. We lived in this fortress called the police department, and we were there was no personalization going on whatsoever. There were very few, if any, partnerships going on. This happened to be the community I lived in too. I raised 5 daughters in this community, and I worked in Boulder, Colorado, which is like 15, 20 miles down the road. And so I was appointed police chief of the town that I lived in. So I had many friends and many acquaintances, and this is the town I still live in. And so I happened to really enjoy this town, and I was honored and privileged to be its public safety chief. By the way, public safety oversaw fire, police, and a number of other social services, including a couple we created to deal specifically with addiction and mental health. So that was kind of what I ran into there. And I will also say that I used the word back then, but things were relatively primitive. And there was a lot of use of force. There was a lot of car chases. There was a lot of very hard-nosed, aggressive policing. And there was zero trust between our Latino community and the police department, mainly because a few years prior to that, we had our own Minneapolis, our own George Floyd, our own Ferguson, when one of the white police officers shot and killed 2 Hispanic boys, and that set this town ablaze. And so there was that's where we started in terms of moving forward. There eventually, we had 2 collective bargaining entities within fire and police, and so there were all these dynamics at play in terms of how we could progress forward, what we needed to do, and how we needed to do it. And so I don't know if that answers your upfront question, Dan, but that's what I inherited. So, and by the way, crime was through the roof, I should say. We had incredible issues with gang activity in this community. We had 450 gang members, 13 gangs. We were the domestic violence capital of Colorado in terms of per capita lethal deaths. And the part 1 crime, the serious crime that we look at in this country was higher than just about anywhere else in that Front Range area of Colorado. And so there were a few messes.
And I'm wondering how that played in towards maybe shifting the mindset. What was involved in changing your mindset as an organization, as a department, with all these different moving pieces and all these different, complex issues happening. I'm wondering what were really the reasons why you really decided to take a different approach and really shift things up?
Well, my reasons didn't change from the time I moved from Boulder, employed with Boulder, to employed with Longmont. I believed in our community, and I believe people in our community had lots to offer. And there was zero communication going on with the media and the police, public safety were at war with each other. And so the police department had this very surly reputation. But I believe that this community, people in this community, from what I've known about and raising my daughters, there were a lot of people who had gifts, and they wanted to offer those gifts. They just didn't feel like they either had permission or they didn't know how. And so there was that huge resource out there. And where I came from is that, public safety is a community responsibility. In many communities, it's seen as the police department or the fire department's responsibility. And so I believe it's an entire community responsibility. Everybody's responsible for their brother's keeper and for bearing their brother's burdens and helping out in terms of creating very close knitted neighborhoods and bringing people together who have never been brought together before, because there was not only the Latino mistrust in the police, there was also significant Latino mistrust in the Caucasian population. And by the way, I unfortunately, there was considerable racism, and the Latino population were on one side of town and everybody else seemed to be on another side of town. There's been a tremendous number of changes that have gone on with that. And this is what I believe police departments can do. I believe police departments can be a part of healing a community's woundedness. You know, for decades, all we did was criminalize it. All we did was criminalize our social and health issues. And so we had these wars that went on, the war on drugs, the war on any social or health issue, which, by the way, not only have we lost all of them, they've, in some ways, those scorched earth policies created significant issues within our communities, including racial injustice, including over policing certain economically disadvantaged groups. And so I believe that we could be part of the healing of the woundedness. I believe we could actually begin to identify what's good in our community. And I believe that we could create a public safety department that could be a beacon of hope in our community. And so that was what I believed and thought. And I kept my eyes on that prize the whole time. Believe me, there was considerable gnashing of teeth, crawling over glass, unions wanting to have no confidence votes in me, my boss not being sure about me, the community writing various letters because the police officers and firefighters were out there in the community saying this isn't the way we ought to be doing policing or fire service. I had city elected officials who were not happy because they were getting complaints, but that's where I stood in terms of keeping both feet on the ground and moving forward. And so there's been a lot that's happened between then and where we're at now, Dan.
For sure. And in terms of, you know, beyond the shifting of your mindset, actually going out and building those relationships and building the trust between the different neighbors, could you tell us a little bit about that process of how you actually went out to communities to uncover the gifts that residents had and really build those trusts?
So that was an hour by hour, day by day, week by week process. There's nothing overnight about it. I believed in the art of having great conversations with my staff, with our staff, with the community. And so we set up tremendous numbers of forums initially to have those conversations. And we put various groups in the same room. We just didn't have a conversation with the Latinos, a conversation with the business community or the schools. We put everybody often in the same room with some exceptions. And so, you know, we started off that way. And the initial long-range strategic planning process included 1,000 people, 900 of them from our community. And it took 18 months and so that began the initial, how do we get to know each other? How do we begin to think about each other differently? How do we get to understand? How can we break down the barriers that are there? But more important, that was part of the process. The results and strategies that we came up with were very much focused on healing the woundedness in our community. And so there were a number of things that happened, too many to talk about now. But one of the things that we did was, everything in the organization had to change. All the systems and the processes and the kinds of people we hired, how we trained, how we led, the philosophy of our policing, even the architecture and how the police department and fire department were designed from a very paramilitary-like structure to another one, all had to change, all had to shift. Everything had to have this congruence with this philosophy of being a public safety department in partnership with our community. And so all of that had to take place over time. None of that happens right away. But one of the things we did down the road a little bit was we created what we called the belonging revolution. And I and my good friend Dan Benavides would walk every Sunday morning for years. I think it was 5 or 6 years. We walked every Sunday morning in mostly high density apartment complex mobile home park like neighborhoods. And so our staff was walking neighborhoods too, with the sole goal of encouraging people to feel and believe they belong to this community. You know, that whole idea of belonging becomes so important no matter where we're at. We can be in families, we can be in businesses, part of the Tamarack Institute. But this was about community, because when people feel like they belong, they feel like they have a relationship with the community. And they also feel like they own the community. This community belongs to me. And when you own something, you're more likely to take care of it. And so Dan and I went specifically on over 200 Sunday morning walks and talked to over 4,000 people, mostly in those areas. And it all ended with an invitation. The invitation was, would you like to become more involved, engaged in our community? And by the time we were at that point in the conversation, a lot of barriers had broken down. We were invited into homes, kitchen tables. We were invited to meet family, neighbors. And that's when we, no surprise, because I kind of realized this was an affirming kind of realization. People do have gifts. They do want to offer those gifts. And again, they just didn't feel like they could offer them for whatever reason that was. And it was amazing how many people we got. I'd say 80% of the people we talked to said not only yes, but very enthusiastically yes. And so that was one example of something we did to kind of surface and activate what we call social capital, the gifts, the talents, expertise, the resources, and to somehow coordinate that in a way that it could be leveraged so that it could work for the good of the whole. And there were many things that we were working on. As I indicated, our woundedness was like not unlike any other community, but typically these things are reserved for the dealing with the woundedness, or whatever those things might look like in terms of social health issues, are reserved for the service providers, the professional service providers, the systems people, the folks in government, the public safety. Well, our whole idea was, as I had said before, was no, we wanted to pull in the entire community, because there was nothing that all of us together in terms of service providers or public safety or government could do that we couldn't even begin to address the extent of the woundedness that exists in our community. But by the way, I also want to make this point right now, Dan, that we just didn't focus on our community as a problem to be solved. Our conversations and our way of doing the work was to say, hey, what's happening that's going well? Where's the goodness? Where's this? Where can we find that and expand it? And my mantra became, for every bad thing that happens, there's 1,000 good things that happen. And we worked in high schools. We worked in, can't tell you how much work we did in the school systems. But that was our message. That became our message. And so that there was a tremendous amount of goodness to be surfaced and activated and coordinated. And I believe that. I believe the change model for now and into the future is not to see either organizations, communities, or people through the lens of their deficiencies, but to see them through the lens of what's possible. And it's an entirely different conversation when you look through it from that lens. It doesn't mean that you avoid the problems and you avoid the things that are not happening that you wish weren't happening, but the overall tone and tenor and lean in these conversations is towards what's possible, what's good, what are our strengths, what are our assets. So I'm saying we're getting some questions and open to those too.
Absolutely, yeah. I think these are questions around your approach, whether there's an article available, and then there's also a question here around links or resources around the belonging revolution, because I know it seems really inspiring in a lot of ways of what was the process that you went through, and I know it's not a cookie cutter approach, but it definitely seems like it's really inspiring to
there's a
lot of
website called Belonging Revolution.
And
yeah, you can go look at it. And
yeah.
we Dan and I were kind of informal when we first started this, but very soon after we started, maybe 6 months or so after we started, we began chronicling every single person we met. And 99% of the people would let them take their photograph with us. And we would tell their story. We would do write-ups, which by the way are on the website. We would do write-ups and talk about what we encountered, who we encountered, what the state of their minds were, and what they thought about our community, and kind of told their story as well. And so it wasn't just our story about what we found, it was their story that came forward. And so there is that, and there's plenty of documentation. I can send some of that to you if you want, Dan. I mean, I don't even know where to begin to start with that. But I also want to say that, some people are very interested in, well, how did this all end up? We started off, when I started with Longmont, we had like 65,000 people, 5,000 Part 1 crimes, over 450 gang members. And we were averaging, 2 to 3 women dying a year from domestic violence. Well, in 2020, when I left, there were our Part 1 crime was down to less than like 2,700 for a community of 100,000 people. So we grew by 40,000 people, but the Part 1 crime was significantly different. We went from 450 gang members to less than 70. We've had zero gang activity in this community since like 2012 or 2013, somewhere in there. And the number of women who have died over the years, in the 20-some years, and there was a whole community-wide process that we dealt with domestic violence on. And by the way, that's been pigeonholed into the criminal justice system in most cities and most jurisdictions. We opened that up and we treated it like a health issue. And there were a number of folks, including neighborhoods, businesses, churches, schools, a number of groups that kind of coalesced and came together. Bottom line is unfortunately, we've had 2 women die of domestic violence since the year 2000. But that's opposed to 2 to 3 women dying every year. Still too many. And so, but we were able to create a process where we were able to intervene a lot sooner in the domestic violence cycle before the battering got very serious. There's a lot of information about that. We formed another group called the Longmont Ending Violence Initiative that focused entirely on domestic violence. Later, it focused on sex assaults in terms of making this a community-wide approach. And so as we invited these people on these walks, we said, hey, we have issues with addiction. We have issues with mental health issues and mental illness. We have issues with domestic violence. We have all these things going on in our community, and we need you. This is your community. And so it's this belief in other people. And what we stayed away from was commodifying the needs of people so that we could see those folks as folks who could become, they could become the benefit of others around them. And there's a whole neuroscience that I won't go into about this, but I will mention the neuroscientist's name that I had lots of conversations with, invited him to Longmont. His name is Dr. Bruce Perry. Highly recommend him in terms of, he believes, his bottom line belief is that one of the greatest healing forces we have on this planet are healthy, connected relationships. And as you all know, the opposite to addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. The same thing with folks struggling with their mental health, the same thing with folks struggling with homelessness, the same thing struggling with all these kinds of issues that we've declared war on and said, okay, we're going to pass laws and we're going to stiffen penalties to address all of these issues, when in fact, the real answer lies in terms of the community, the people in the community being a part of the healing process. And so our police department our public safety department became very much involved in surfacing and activating and coordinating a lot of that assistance towards, and I could go into a lot of examples of what that looked like, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and it seems like the underlying tone of what you're doing was humanizing people and not looking at their deficiencies as kind of a consumer, but understanding that they can provide the solutions that they need and be the producers, of the core function of safety. And I've heard you in other conversations talk about the idea of, wanting to work yourself out of a job. What does that process look like? And what are the kind of barriers that are coming in place when you're coming from a police department to attempt to shift yourself out into, working yourself out of a job?
Our metric for effectiveness was we're no longer needed. And I think that should be the metric of effectiveness for any social service private, public, nonprofit, agency, organization. It should be but it doesn't mean that you let the problems go. It means that you have created enough self-sufficiency that can sustain itself in the community to be able to deal with the issues that you initially were brought in to deal with. And so our metric became, we're no longer needed. And in fact, we created something within public safety where if you wanted, this was an incentive for our staff. If you wanted to kind of be recognized at another level and to receive compensation and more benefits, you had to show directly with the community as a witness for you that you did exactly that I came and that I'm no longer needed. And that became a real institutionalized approach to how we dealt with that metric of we're no longer needed. And so why wouldn't it be? Why should it be? Why? I mean, I just, oftentimes I see these output measurements in terms of, well, we served 10,000 meals, or we found 10,000 beds, or we did this in terms of numbers of people that were served. I think those are the wrong ways of looking at, are you successful or effective? I'm thinking the right way is, well, what have you done for people that they no longer need you to provide them a meal or a bed or a service, that they can self-sustain themselves and become self-sufficient in ways. So, you can't do it for everybody all the time, but you can actually, but you can begin that process of moving forward. That's why the gangs went away. That's why domestic violence, the lethality of domestic violence disappeared. That's why the homeless population in our community began to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. That's why the number of folks that were struggling with addiction, by the way, we opened up our front doors to anybody who was struggling from a chemical substance addiction. If you came through our front door and you said, I have a chemical substance addiction, bring in your drugs, bring in your paraphernalia, we'll destroy that and we will find you treatment. And we had agreements with over 100 different addiction treatment service providers. And the last I heard, and I haven't kept up with this, but we provided over $3 million in free treatment to people in our community because service providers agreed to do that. And so, and I'm talking residential treatment, I'm talking intensive outpatient treatment, and people came in with a variety of chemical substance addiction, including meth, including heroin, including Oxycontin, and the number one, by the way, the number one chemical substance that people are still addicted to is alcohol. And so, but oftentimes there was a mixture of those things. So we opened up our organization in a way that said, this is who we are. Now, by the way, we didn't give up our role of enforcement. We didn't, but we really did what we needed to do to refine that. And we really did what we needed to do in order to make sure it was community driven. And we did what we needed to do to make sure we were being judicious. And as you said at the beginning, we created probably the most robust restorative justice process of anywhere in America. I'm serious about that. In terms of, we put thousands and thousands, the last count I had was 7,000 offenders went through the restorative justice process. And for those offenders, everyone's a victim. And so we changed the nature of what justice looked like in our community from this retributive pound of flesh, eye for an eye, to something where, if you're familiar with restorative principles and practices, where the person who committed the harm has to choose accountability. The person who was harmed, their voice is the centerpiece of the conversation. And oh, by the way, the community was involved. They have influence on the outcome. And so the nature of what the definition of justice in our community began to change and shift. The other thing that I have to mention is we disassociated considerably from the hip of the criminal justice system as we connected more with the heart of our community. And we put a number of things in place, including dealing with folks struggling with their mental health or addiction. Beyond that, we did more with folks who were struggling with addiction in terms of implementing harm reduction models. And that all ran out of public safety. And so we, and by the way, all those things emerged out of our long-range strategic plan in terms of coming up with alternatives to the criminal justice system, things that worked. But I basically said to those 900 people that were involved, we can't do this on our own. We need you. We need every one of you. And so we kept up that kind of flood of an invitation, that flood of encouraging people to belong, because you really can't make a great invitation to somebody until they feel and believe like they belong. And so there was a sequence there for us that we worked through that, and we considered ourselves revolutionaries for belonging. And that's what I think a police department, a public safety department can do in any community in North America, and keep their role of being the enforcers of the law when they need to be, active and assertive enough, where there are folks in the community that if they're there because of their presence, the community is not safe, they need to be removed from the community, so be it. And so that was a big shift. We changed our hiring profiles. We changed how we trained. We changed so many different things in order to kind of accommodate this philosophy of public safety.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And that ties into a question that we have here in the chat. We're going to shift towards asking questions. So if, as a reminder, if people wanted to add those in the Q&A or the chat, you're welcome to. And so this is, tying in from your last point, we have a question that's asking, did you have community police officers who were specifically trained to facilitate these kinds of asset-focused conversations and actions in the community? So that's a question from Angie. And also, what were the characteristics that you were, the characteristics that you were looking for
Sure.
people that were working within the police department?
Yeah, and fire, by the way, too. So no, we didn't compartmentalize our services. We made it clear that everybody had to think this way. It wasn't, we just didn't have a unit of a few people. I know that there's a lot of departments across North America, definitely in this country, that have their community policing unit or have their community services unit. We said, no, this is our philosophy as a police department. This is who we are. This is who everybody needs to be. That's the expectation coming in. And by the way, the hiring, when you do work like this, there's a lot of departments saying, well, we're having a hard time finding people. We never had a hard, because we shifted our thinking and our philosophy. People were drawn to this more so than the adrenaline fix of lights and sirens or car chases or putting the bad guy in jail. I'm not saying that there aren't people drawn to that, but I think the market increases dramatically when you're saying, no, we have a public service and this is what we're about. And I just think generations coming up, well, I don't know which generation it is. There's all these names for these various generations. And that I think more people are tied in those generations to this sense of social responsibility. And that's who we try to make ourselves. And so, so the characteristics of things we were looking for, the number one characteristic was we wanted people who thrived in relationships, who wanted to form them, who wanted to continue them, who wanted to thrive in them. And that's versus hiring lone cowboys and lone cowgirls or people, I just want to put bad people in jail and that's why I'm here. And so people who thrived in relationships became very, very critical. Of course, communication skills became absolutely critical in terms of interpersonal, the capacity to convene, the capacity to invite, the capacity to facilitate, the capacity to do all those things that we needed, public speaking. We even began to train on how you can harmonize contrast in various groups. Because when you put various groups together and they had different points of view, what can you do as a facilitator to harmonize the contrast that you're encountering in those groups? And so we began to hire people that others might consider statespeople, stateswomen, statesmen, people who cared about the good of the whole, people who really believed that your voice counts, other people's voices count, their thoughts matter, their humanness is valued, maybe most importantly, and we screen for those things. And so we bring in those folks into our community. We brought in teachers, social workers, other professions, people wanted to come and work in Longmont. And by the way, we were able to work it out to where, this is kind of a side note, to where if you were able to achieve that other level that I talked about earlier, you were the highest paid police officer in the state of Colorado. And by the way, there's that also served as a draw for people wanting to work in Longmont. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of getting the support, we have a question around what's happening more on a state level. So the idea of how did the state of Colorado or academia get involved in supporting your new way of policing? So outside of Longmont.
Well, number one, we used we have two universities, big universities near us, University of Colorado, Colorado State. We used a lot of their research and research capacity. We also brought in a person who was a PhD in economics to help us with a number of things in terms of dealing with how we could measure our success and how we could kind of weigh, because one of the things people kept asking was, well, how do you know this is working versus the criminal justice system? And I always reminded people that, what, we did this study. The research showed that when we did this study, we looked at hundreds of people we arrested 1 year, this is years ago, for the crimes of burglary, car break-ins, and vandalism, and found out that on average, each of them had been arrested prior to that year 9 times. And that each of them had 16 charges. So we're not asking those questions. How's the criminal justice system working anywhere? I can guarantee you those recidivism rates are good anywhere, especially for the departments that are arresting those folks. And so we used academia to help us with the research, and we used academia to help us with figuring out what were the results of what we were doing as we compared and contrasted our alternatives to the criminal justice system to the criminal justice system itself. And so we kept track, because we knew anytime you try to introduce a new idea, everyone wants to know what the data says. And so you don't get data with new ideas, by the way, Dan. You got to start. Someone's got to take that step, that leap, and say, we believe this is, but you didn't have to leap far, because recidivism rates were through the roof. Neighborhoods languished in disconnectedness. You had lack of transparency. You had incredibly expensive criminal justice systems that were not producing. And no one was asking those questions. We've gotten a little bit kind of way too focused with this defunding aspect of things. And now, of course, we've kind of cycled back into the refunding because of the perception of, and so none of those are long-term solutions. You got to think about it entirely different when you're working in government. And it's not so much, well, how much money do you have or how much money don't you have? It's what are you doing with what resources that you have, and how's that playing out in your community? And I just talked about a lot of that. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have another question here, actually coming from Connor. So taken from our other participants. So it's thinking about when you were just beginning to do your relationship building with your community. What is one thing that you wish you knew back then that you do know now in hindsight?
Great question. Yeah, I have to tell you, somebody asked me if my long tenure helped. Yeah, it did. It helped me. It helped us give us the time to learn from all of our failures, because we had the time to do that in that long-term tenure. And the other thing is we could build on our successes. But the thing that I wish I knew back then was how complex this really was. I mean, I went into it, I won't say I went into it naively, but I went into it with an ideal. And that ideal was very much grounded in me. And how much work, how much time, how much energy, how much pain you'd have to go through to shift cultures, not only a public safety culture, but a community culture around their responsibility for engagement, their responsibility to bear their brother or sister's burdens, their responsibility to become engaged, involved, and take responsibility for outcomes. There is a lot of work that shift those cultures. And so there were a lot of specific things along the way where I wished I had a different kind of conversation with somebody, and you learn from your experience that, well, okay, the next time I'm not going to say this, or the next time I am going to say this, or the next time I'm going to have different people in the room that I think can coalesce better, or whatever that might be. There's so many little things along the way, but you know, and none of this is done in a big way. There's no overnight. There's no. This is done one person at a time, one room at a time, one neighborhood at a time. And by the way, success doesn't mean continued success. There's always 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And sooner or later it becomes 4 steps forward, 1 step back. And sooner or later it becomes 5 steps forward and maybe a baby step back. All of those things you kind of have to work through. You know, we have people come into our department and say, well, you know, I want to get cured. I want to get healed from my addiction. I can't tell you how many times we ran into people that relapsed. And so, you know, that's part of that 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. You got to have patience. And by the way, I use the word love a lot in terms of how I talk with our staff and how I talk to our department, in terms of relationship and connection amongst and between people, because that's really what it's about. You know, this isn't a government program. This isn't a system of, it is a government process. It is a philosophy. But what's enshrouding all of that, what transcends all of that, is compassion, generosity, this sense of, I care for my fellow women and men, that their voices do count, their thoughts do matter. And so there's that, and I made that very clear internally, that that's who we were, that's who we were going to become. And that's who we hired. And that's how we were going to operate within the community. And by the way, the mirroring of that within the department, they got, our staff got to see, well, this is how I'm being treated within our department. And this is what they want me to do in the community. You can't ask a police officer in a command and control environment to go out and work in partnership with the community. They don't know what it means because there's no one modeling it for them. And so you have to figure out, and I use words like partnership, stewardship, ownership. I use words like adventure. And so all of those things became part of the rhetoric and part of who we were. And eventually that's how it got communicated to the community. And by the way, you asked about elected officials. I'm not a big fan of legislating our future or trying to figure out how we can legislate transformation. That won't happen, folks. It just won't happen. Transformation comes about entirely different than trying to legislate it. And so when elected officials, whether they were state or federal, would come to me and say, hey, Chief, what kind of laws would you like to see passed? And inevitably they stopped coming to me because every year my answer was none. And I would say, we're not going to be able to create something different by your legislation, which by the way becomes lowest common denominator, compromise thinking when the bill is finally signed by the governor. And you wonder why you even have the legislation. As if legislation and different penalties will serve as an insurance policy that's going to help us with or protect us from the human condition. I've never seen that happen. And so I'm not saying throw legislation out the window, but when it comes down to these community-wide social and health issues, and each community is a little bit different, statewide legislation that is the product is lowest common denominator thinking can do more harm, and in terms of its unintended consequences. So I had great relationships with our elected officials. It's just that I didn't try to put anything on their plate to try to get the governor to sign something.
Yeah, and we have a comment here that's saying, this is really refreshing to hear this kind of language, and definitely bringing up the concepts of love and compassion. It feels really refreshing in a lot of ways. And so we have a couple more questions before we're going to close out.
Sure.
And so I have a summarized question from Gregory. So the question is, Greg's question is on community safety and crime rates. So he provides some federal stats on crime rates within the area, within Longmont, suggesting there has been a significant increase in the past 5 years. So he asks, how can we promote these excellent community strategies when crime rates are also in effect increasing?
I think I understand that. What do we, let's see. So first of all, you're not, crime is a symptom of underlying something else. You know, if you ask any police chief in America, probably in Canada, name 3 big social issues that's causing a lot of crime in your community, they'll most likely tell you often addiction, or people struggling with mental health, or homelessness, or broken families, or whatever that might look like. But there are some big ones that, because all crime is the symptom of something that's underlying. And so how do you address the underlying? And how do you, and by the way, that was my whole point of this, is you don't address the underlying on your own. And you help build strong neighborhoods, which we hadn't had a conversation about in terms of the work we did in our neighborhoods. But you build strong neighborhoods and you deal with these social and health issues in partnership with your community. You bring the gifts of talents, resources, and expertise of tens of thousands of people in your community you give them a seat at the table. And they know their voice counts and their thoughts matter. And then there's a coordination of that begins to say, here's what we're going to be doing. We had a number of employers who were willing to offer people in recovery jobs, employment. We had people who were willing to open up their homes to someone who was in recovery. We worked on a lot of those things over the years so that the community was engaged. You got to remember, if you're thinking about this as a government program or just public safety, you're thinking about it wrong. All public safety did was become the catalyst for engaging a much larger community in addressing the woundedness in our community versus saying, hey, let's go pass a law and we'll criminalize this. So it's you can address, that's how I think crime ultimately should be addressed. Now, there are things that happen in a community where you have psychopathic, sociopathic behaviors that, we don't know what to do with some of that behavior. And some of those folks need to be removed from the community. And I made it clear to our officers, we're not here to punish people. We're not here. This is not about being punitive. This is about keeping our community safe. That's our goal. And I think if we ask 3 questions, sometimes the 3 questions that would really help the criminal justice system is, what do you need to do to keep your criminal justice system safe? What do you need to do to minimize recidivism? And what do you need to do to help victims of harm kind of heal and become more whole? Those 3 questions could become the catalyst for an entirely different set of conversations that's going to change a lot of philosophy, policies, and practices, from the police department to the DA's office to the judicial to the probation, parole. Those are the questions that need to be asked more so than the questions we're asking now, and which are, how can we get more people to fight crime? And we're going to extort our police department to fight the violence. So we're going to hire more. And our current administration here in the States has, they're saying, well, we need to fund more police. That's always been the kind of the de jure response by elected officials. We're going to hire more police. We're going to increase I've been through so many of those cycles in my own career. It's become laughable in terms of those being quality long-term answers.
Yeah. And I have time for just one more question. And so this question is coming around the ideas of other communities or examples that you've seen, since your retirement, some of the communities that you've connected to. Are there any current examples of communities that have really taken on this approach? And do you have any examples that you could share out with us?
So what I've been asked to help other communities is typically because these communities are in crisis. And I won't name the communities, but some of them are pretty large. Some of them are a little smaller. But what I noticed is that police chiefs, mayors, elected officials are on bended knee trying to figure out what they can do differently, even in light of kind of the change that's happening. So there is a lot of interest. There is a lot of, we need something different kind of mindset and language going on around this. And so I'm heartened by the idea that okay, well, sometimes I wonder if police departments think they've escaped kind of the microscope of whether it's the media, elected officials, or their communities, because the rates of violence are so high. are they wiping their brow and saying, gosh, I'm glad we have all this violence. So we're more needed now, and people are going to get off our case, and they're not going to care if we beat somebody up, or they're not going to care if we did something wrong because they don't want to criticize. I'm a little concerned that that could be happening again in terms of that shift back and forth. But I'm also very heartened by seeing that there's a lot of police chiefs and mayors saying we got to do something different, because they're saying we can't get, because it could be, they could be the town where the incident occurs, that all of a sudden CNN and Fox and MSNBC are on your doorstep saying, we want to know more about why this happened. And so that's not the right reason to do that. But I think that's partly what's in the back of their mind. So I am heartened by what I'm seeing.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time today. And
Welcome.
for those questions that we weren't able to get to, we'll be following up with those. And we're going to be following up with all the resources that we did mention today. I think we have time for a couple of announcements before we're going to end our call. But again, thanks, former Police Chief Mike Butler, for joining on today and talking about the context within Longmont, really inspiring us north of the border and beyond. And yeah, so we'll get into a couple of announcements. If Connor, you could share the screen there. Perfect, thank you. So in terms of what's happening within Deepening Community, we're growing as an organization, as a network across Canada. We have over 40 members who are, since 2016, we've been initiating this work that's reducing social isolation and working on building stronger connections within community. And one of the topics that we are diving into exploring more is the function of safety within our communities. So we're really excited about the possibilities of growing this network. And if you're interested in learning more, you can connect with us. And part of the supports that we do offer is our communities of practices, our webinars, events, publications, and we have specialized coaching as well. So we actually are announcing, I'm going to throw in the chat here, that we're going to be starting a community of practice within a month that is focusing on neighborhood safety. And so it's exploring this topic even further. So you're invited, along with those within your network, to join this bi-monthly community of practice. And so in 1 month, we're going to be having our first session. And if you're an organization or a municipality that's interested in becoming a partner with us, you can reach out to myself at any point. I'm open to having a conversation about how you can be actively involved in developing this community of practice. And so for the next slide, we actually also have an upcoming event in London, Ontario. So for those who are interested in learning more about taking an asset-based approach, from June 7th until 9th, in less than a month there, we will be hosting our Celebrating Neighbors event in Fanshawe College. So really focusing around the ideas of measuring your impact around taking an asset-based community development approach. So this ties really well into our conversations. And if you're interested in learning more and getting engaged with this event, it's happening June 7th and 9th in London, Ontario. And so I think that might be the last announcements that we do have before. If you did want to find our webinars, we have those available online, and we're going to be following up with a recording of this as well. If you have any feedback, or you're interested in getting involved with either our in-person event in London, or also being an active partner within our upcoming community of practice, feel free to reach out to myself at any point. My email is listed there. So again, thank you very much for the conversations today. And, I hope you all have a really great day, and I'm glad that this is the initial start of a deeper conversation. So thanks, Mike Butler, today.